I'm delighted to welcome today Professor Gordon Hughes, who is a professor of economics at Edinburgh University and also a former advisor to the World Bank on energy. Welcome, Gordon. Thank you for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure to join you.
So, Gordon, you've been looking into your sort of specialism is economics, but you've spent a lot of time looking into net zero policies and the crossover between what we're doing to try and reduce our carbon emissions and the impact that might have on bills and on the economy and on our spending. And I'm very interested. We've had some news today, which we can talk about with the energy price rise. But I wanted to start by talking in broad terms about the work that you've looked at and why you think that the net zero ambition for 2050 may cost us more than we've been led to believe.
Well, we need to go back a little while. My involvement in climate change and the economics of climate change goes back actually to the very early 1990s when, as you have remarked on, I was at the World Bank and we were writing a general review of environmental problems in developing countries. I was responsible for writing the chapter on climate change in that report, and that was probably the first general review of the impacts of climate change with a particular focus on developing countries. Now, gradually, the issue at that point was quite modest. It was a background issue rather than a forefront one, except for those involved in the environment. But gradually it became more prominent, and my involvement continued right the way through the advisory work I did at the World Bank, which was for 10 years. But in the end of the 2010s, I was asked to look at the relative costs of adapting to climate change, in other words, accepting that it was happening and then doing the best we could to accommodate it, cope with it, whatever you like to call. In the terminology, it's referred to adaptation versus mitigation, that is to say, trying to stop it. The problem with posing those as alternatives is that since the climate is changing, we have to adapt anyway. So we've got to spend the money to cope with the increase in temperatures that we're experiencing. On the other side, mitigating climate change is difficult and expensive. And the position that I have in climate zero is that already by 2010, the boat had sailed, that a very large amount of increase in temperature was inevitable. And what was more important even than that was that the key players had moved on from being countries like the United States and Europe to being China and India and the economies in Asia. And they were not willing to accept substantial costs to their economic growth in order to slow the reduction in carbon emissions. There wasn't any doubt that those emissions would grow, but they would gradually tail off and probably peak in the way that they did in the rich countries 20 or 30 years earlier. And my doubts about net zero have to do with the fact that those are policies over which we have no control. It is pointless to pretend that our committing to net zero makes the slightest difference to what China is going to do.
Well, I mean, I understand is it about 1% or 2% we contribute to global emissions, carbon emissions? Is that right? In the UK, is that right?
It's somewhat less than 1%.
But isn't the argument that you have to look after your own household? You've got to be a leader and you've got to do what you can to mitigate against what is such a terrible prospect with global warming and all the consequences that come with it? You can't just say, well, they're not doing it, so therefore we won't.
There are two elements to that. The first, which we can come back to, is whether it's such a terrible prospect, which nothing that I know suggests that. The second part is doing your share is one thing. Controlling emissions at very great expense to yourself, while not making the slightest difference to what happens at the world level, is, I think, a level of policy which is hard to believe is particularly sensible.
Well, the government would argue that it's not harmful. The business leaders have there's been a report just out recently about how net zero economy has grown, boosted our production by 10%. We've got £83 billion. Once we get our clean energy and our renewable energy, we won't be relying on volatile gas markets, and all will be good. And isn't this the way to go? Because it's not just about emissions in the climate, it's also about pollution and the fossil fuels that are finite.
Right. There's lots of separate elements in that. The first is you're referring to a study that was produced by CBI Economics on what is called green jobs. Now,
the Centre of Business Industries, is it? The Centre of the Confederation of British Industry. Yeah, sorry.
Confederation of British Industry. Now, that's an old hoary chestnut that I actually wrote about 12 years ago. There were practically no green jobs 12 years ago. There are very few more now today. What those numbers, in fact, mask is essentially a vast range of activities that would happen whether or not we were trying to pursue net zero or not. The actual jobs that are directly associated with running solar farms or wind farms or the other things we do, are very small. I mean, what those numbers do is that they count the fact that doing insulation to housing is a good thing. And it's a good thing whether we're pursuing net zero or not. The other thing is it removes us from exposure to gas prices. Now, that's one of the biggest grounds that are nowadays put forward for the argument that we should move away from fossil fuels, even if we weren't worrying about carbon emissions. The problem with it is that it's an argument that reflects a pattern of the world that it was 15 years ago, not the way it is today. The issue at that time was that from the mid-1990s through to 2010, roughly speaking, Britain as an economy, came to rely much more on gas because gas was abundant, it was relatively cheap, and we were able to adopt a new technology for power generation, which was much more efficient than the previous coal plants and so forth. The problem is that what wasn't acknowledged at the time was that gas is a volatile market. It's like oil. It goes up and it goes down. If you actually look carefully over a series of years, what happens is roughly 1 year in 10, we get exposed to very bad periods when gas prices are very high. And what happened to us in 2022 is the classic example of that 1 year in 10. But for the remaining 9 years out of 10, they tend to be low and competitive. So in effect, this argument is, what are we prepared to pay for insurance against that 1 year in 10 when things are quite bad?
Well, the government's blamed today's price rise on that volatile market and has said that the reason why our bills are so high is because we are relying on volatile markets and we need to rely on ourselves and we need to have homegrown, renewable, clean energy, which will mean we don't need this reliance anymore.
Right. They've always said that. And they were saying that 15, even 20 years ago. This has been an obsession of the British government, and it's been an obsession because in the mid-2000s, we stopped being self-reliant on gas production. Essentially,
is there a finite source of gas? Sorry to interrupt you, but is that a myth? Do we have enough? I mean, we've got shale gas, which involves fracking, and sources in the North Sea. Is that something that's going to run out within a decade? What's the situation?
Under current policies, the amount of gas that we have is going to run out very quickly. We will not be self-sufficient in gas at any time in the future. Because
you say at current policies, could we, with a different agenda, if we used the resources we've got?
No, it's doubtful. It's no more likely that we're going to be self-sufficient in gas than we have been self-sufficient in oil. But then we're not self-sufficient in copper or lots and lots of other things. It isn't the issue of self-sufficiency. It is essentially whether we have a strategy that essentially manages the fact that we're exposed to world markets in a way that mitigates the impact of what is undoubtedly a volatile market. But then food prices go up and down, lots of things. That's the modern world in terms of that. And I think the problem here is that in order to move away from gas, and this is the thing we have to recognize, the other side of what the government is saying. In order to move away from gas, we are building offshore wind farms, we are building solar plants, and lots of things like that. Now, the cost of building a solar plant or an offshore wind farm is approximately 8 times higher than to build a power plant that runs on gas.
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private internet access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private internet access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
So we are spending, in broad terms, something of the order of £8,000 per unit of electricity generated to invest in an offshore wind farm where we could spend £1,000 for a gas plant that produces an equivalent amount of electricity. That cost is really big. That means we have to devote money to paying for those investments that we cannot spend on other bits of our economy, whether that other bits of our economy are hospitals or roads or factories that manufacture pharmaceuticals or whatever they may be. There is a cost to doing all of those things. And that's why I'm really asking the question, is that cost of insurance worth the exposure to the discomfort of the occasional spike in gas prices?
But once we've built that infrastructure, then what's not to like? We won't have these problems anymore. And, if it's just a bit more pain for more gain later, then surely it's a good thing. We will build these things and then we won't have the pain anymore. So down the line, our future generations will benefit from something we've invested in, although it's expensive.
They last for between 15 and 20 years. So you have to rebuild them every 15 or 20 years. A gas plant lasts for longer than that and is far cheaper. So the problem isn't, this is not a once for all cost. This is a cost which recurs, and it recurs more frequently than most people believe because the plants stop operating as efficiently, because they're operating in very difficult, hostile surroundings, or because while the technology is in principle not changing, in practice it's got a limited life.
What about solar farms?
The same thing. The average solar farm declines in its output, holding the amount of sun constant. It declines at about 2% a year. So what that means is that if you start with getting sort of 100 units, megawatt hours or whatever from solar plants, after 15 years, you're actually only getting 75. And after 25, you're down to 60%. The point is, at that point, they become uneconomic to run because the maintenance costs become too high and the output is too low. So you have to replace them after between 15 and 20 years.
Can't we use batteries the technology is surely going to improve so that we can adapt and use more cleaner energy sources, such as batteries, to store energy, and things won't be as they are now?
Batteries are solving a different problem. Batteries are not about the life of plants. They're about the fact that all of these plants produce intermittently. They're not available necessarily when we want to produce the electricity. I mean, think of us now. We're talking in the early evening. There isn't much sun around in February. There isn't much sun around. So solar plants are not going to be much use in providing the power for people, for us to record this or to do any of the other things. Batteries partly fill that gap by shifting when the power is available. But the problem is that if they're intensively used, batteries are even less long life than our solar plants. They last for between 10 and 15 years. And they're very, very expensive for even quite short amounts of exposure. The bigger problem about both solar and wind farms is really illustrated by what happened in December here and again in January. There are periods of time when we have very little wind and very little sun in the middle of winter. And at that point, if you are relying purely on solar and wind power, a crisis very rapidly develops. And that crisis is so potentially severe that we actually have to, even in 2030 or 2040, we will have to have backup generators, all those gas plants, ready to run when we need them because there isn't enough wind or solar available. And that increases the costs.
Well, tell me, let's talk about the costs. So all this is fairly bleak, but if the government's saying it's going to use these sources to bring down our energy prices, and it has said it will bring down our prices by £300. And I know we haven't seen that today, but they are promising that this is going to happen with these renewable energy sources. So why is it so expensive? Obviously, the gas prices are the price that the market, we're relying on imports, we can't influence those. But the electricity, the government has said it wants to decarbonise our electricity system, our electricity grid. And if it can do that and relying on cheap renewable forms of energy, then surely we're going to see that reflected in our bills. And that's a good thing, no matter how much the overhead costs are.
Right. Let's talk numbers in this case. The average bill for electricity that was operative now included £994 per average household, per typical household for electricity.
That's the cap.
Yes. Yep. Now, of that amount, less than £300 was for the wholesale price of electricity in buying that electricity in the market. So think about reducing that total by £300. That's more than the total cost of electricity in the price cap. It isn't possible. These numbers simply are fantasy. The problem is that you're talking about a set of politicians whose grasp of elementary arithmetic is challenged and who are essentially true believers that somehow a commitment to decarbonisation will solve the problems of our energy sector. And the response that we get, of course, is, well, maybe we're not talking about £300 for the cost of electricity. Maybe it's on gas and electricity. But how does electricity remove the cost of gas from the energy bill? Well, all it does is by adding more electricity, by substituting electricity for gas, and substituting it in a way that is not cheaper to generate and not cheaper to use. So
tell me a little bit about those costs. Yeah. So the cost of the electricity, we've talked today about the numbers. So the rise in our electricity bills over the last decade, a lot of that you think has been attributed or can be attributed to net zero policies. So because the wind doesn't always blow and because the sun doesn't always shine, we need these workarounds and backups, which are expensive, and also money to pay for the wind farms to actually switch off when the wind is blowing too hard. Are these problems which are costing us, and it's part of a big part of our bill, are these problems resolvable?
Well, I think we need to separate out. The big item that has increased has been the subsidies that are paid to the wind farms and the solar farms and the like. The subsidies, it's not the cost of using them, it is the cost of subsidizing their output. That has gone up by well over 100% over the period from 2015 to today. By comparison, the cost of buying the electricity in the market has gone up by just over 20%. So
And how much is the net zero policies, in effect, all of those policies increased our electricity bills by what percent?
The net zero policies are partly hidden because they are also in the what are called network charges. Because when you referred to the cost of paying people to switch off power that is not required, that is treated as part in these figures as part of network costs. And the network costs have also gone up substantially. So the difficulty with all of this is that we're talking about numbers which vary a great deal from month to month and from year to year. But overall, the trend, and that's really what we're talking about here, the trend is that greatly more than a half of the increases in the bills that we're paying over the last 10 years has come from net zero policies.
That's the electricity, not the gas. Yeah,
yes,
I get
the electricity.
Yeah,
in terms
and
of
you
that.
don't see that coming down because we're going to continue to have to renew these renewables effectively and build more infrastructure for them. It's not going anywhere soon. Is that what you're saying?
That is all going to get a lot worse. So, in fact, that £300 reduction is likely to be substantially more than that of an increase. And so the bills are actually going to go up due to these policies. They will not come down. And we've all heard that assertion. It isn't even an assertion that the National Energy System Operator, which is now the government-owned company that controls the energy, electricity system and other systems, that system operator said, oh, well, electricity prices might come down by £10 per megawatt hour. That's a lot less than £300. So even the government's own specialist in the area doesn't buy that figure.
Don't believe it. Doesn't buy it. Yeah. So let's move on. And if you're happy to, but I'm happy to talk about this a bit more if you have more to say.
No.
But you've said that obviously this is all, if we're actually trying to help save the planet, we have wildfires, we have glaciers, all these problems, melting ice, and problems with future problems with the warming planet. Surely this is a good reason to just try and do something. It's better than not.
Doing something is different from committing ourselves to a really very large share of our national income in order to reduce the emissions that we as a country emit. So let's take...
Forgive me, just to interrupt. The government has said the impact of climate change itself on the country will cost us heavily. I think they put it at about £100 billion a year, something like that. So it's a huge impact just from the floods, all the other things that are going to happen with climate. So it is important to them and to many people that we mitigate against that because the impact of climate change itself is expensive.
I'm sorry to be blunt. That's complete garbage. One of the problems about a lot of this stuff is that you get very large number of scare stories which are completely unsupported by numbers.
Well, I think it was the Office of Budget Responsibility. Yes, you can talk, but it was the Office of Budget Responsibility that put the figure so high. I can't remember the exact figure, but put a huge price on the impact of climate change on the UK. So it wasn't just a social media scare story. It was the Office of Budget Responsibility, I think.
But I'm sorry, this is my specialist subject.
I respect you. I'm just putting the other side.
And I'm being blunt. That work is garbage. We The problem about this is that if you want to blame all of the natural events, every time we have a flood, and you blame it on climate change, then you can come up with practically any number that you like. But the truth is, there's no evidence for any of that. What there is essentially a clear evidence that temperatures are increasing. Now, let's be clear. Temperatures increasing for much of the world is a benefit. It reduces ill health due to exposure to cold. It increases productivity under the right conditions. It has all kinds of positive impacts. It also has, we fear, negative impacts if the increase becomes too large. But those negative impacts are almost invariably insurable. That is to say, let's take the example in Britain of floods, and then I'll take the example of wildfires. In Britain, the problem we have with floods is that we have failed to take account of the natural pattern of variability in rainfall, and we've insisted on building all over the place on what we call floodplains. So we have increased our exposure to the severity of natural variation in rainfall by building in places which we should not have done so in the past. Now, it's expensive to rectify that mistake, but you can't blame climate change for a mistake that we deliberately chose to go along with. And the same is true for, we all have vivid images, horrible images of what happened in Los Angeles and the wildfires. What nobody points out, rarely point out, is essentially that the Western ecology in the United States is a fire ecology. Fires are a natural process of the natural systems in the United States. The problem is we have spent the last 50 years trying to suppress those fires. And by suppressing those fires, what we've meant is that they are less frequent. They actually burn much lower areas than used to be in the past, but they are much worse when they happen. And to make that even worse, we've insisted on building in places that any Native American would have told you was going to burn every 5 or 10 years in terms of that. In other words, the problem is we've put an enormous amount of our housing, of our infrastructure, of other things in harm's way. And that's really what we are trying to deal with now.
I mean, the IPCC reports, the climate reports have said that, man-made, the impact of man, of our emissions is the biggest driver of this climate change. We're a globe, not just one island in the UK. And so our mitigation strategy is for a broader reason than just our floodplains in the UK. But sort of the melting ice caps, all of these things that are potentially going to cause people being, more refugees, many other problems, famines, droughts. We look at all these models and with alarm. But this is not, obviously you're an economist. Do you think that we have overestimated some of these? Do you think we're getting muddled with, confused with normal weather patterns? And
first of all, it's extraordinarily hard to separate out the normal weather patterns that you're referring to from events that might be associated with climate change. The problem about this is that the climate is always changing. The climate 200 years ago, in the 1800s, was a lot colder than it was today. And that's not because of climate change as we talk about it. It's because that was a period in which Europe was in something known as the Little Ice Age. And it gradually came out of that little ice age over the following 100 to 150 years after the mid 1800s. So essentially, we're trying to separate out what is the human contribution from what is the natural variability. To do so is both very difficult and requires lengths of data that we don't have. So what people do is that they construct climate models. But climate models are not the world. Climate models are a sort of mathematical representation of what we know about the physics. But our knowledge is quite limited, and those climate models are really, really inaccurate. And so what we have is a very clear indication that at a broad level, temperatures are increasing. But at a detailed level, are the climate increases in temperature that have occurred, are those actually driving more floods or more exposure to fires or to other things? The IPCC doesn't claim that they are. They say the evidence is too weak to know. So the problem that we have here is, yes, it's very easy to make very dramatic claims, but are they true? We don't know that.
No. But if we have a much quoted figure, 99% of scientists agree that man is negatively impacting the climate and increasing these temperatures. So that's a huge number of scientists. You're perhaps an outlier. Would you say that, therefore, if we've got some consensus, we should listen to that and behave accordingly?
I'm sorry. Look, what I have said, nothing I've said implies that there is no human effect on the climate. What I've said is we don't know whether that is 50% of the climate change we've seen, or 75%, or 25%. We don't know because we can't know. And the scientists who are making that statement were asked a general question that is meaningless. It is, not a question about saying, do you agree that 85% of the increase in temperature was due to man-made activity rather than 80%? Nobody knows the answer to those questions. And you ask the right questions and you can get enormously high numbers on all of these kind of surveys whose answers none of us really believe very seriously.
No, I do speak to a lot of scientists who are afraid of speaking out about this because there's a lot of censorship and a lot of shutdown of dissenting voices, and there are a number. And I suppose with science, it shouldn't be that way, because science is about discussion and discourse, especially with something so complicated as climate, when we don't really understand much of it.
I mean, one of the reasons that you will see people like me with grey hair and other ways, other activities that we do, being willing to speak out, is because the conformity. I mean, science is horribly conformist, and it's like essentially treating outsiders like Galileo. I mean, the church was absolutely clear that Galileo was a heretic. He was wrong. That's no different from this kind of reaction. It's closure of social groups against outsiders. And
why? Why would that happen? Why do people not? If you're a scientist, surely your raison d'etre is to discover and find out new things and say different things. Why would you close? Right?
But why is it that there are consensuses in all kinds of areas? It's because human beings are social beings. They're naturally dislike being outside the herd. And if you're in a university, it's profoundly uncomfortable to be an outsider unless you have relatively iron belief in what you're doing, and really you are untouchable in some
But
way.
what would be the driver of a consensus? Why would there be, what's the motive? It's costing us dear. It's not practical. It's not easy. Why has there been such a movement towards net zero, particularly in the UK, when it's not doing us any good? If it's not...
Number one, the costs are rarely acknowledged. I mean, we've already discussed the claim that the costs are much greater than the costs of actually changing, and that I'm unambiguously saying is simple nonsense. The other thing is there is rarely a willingness to ask the question: at what speed should we go? Why 2050 rather than 2060 or 2070 or 2080? Is that what an economist, remember I'm an economist, the economist will naturally say, what are the extra benefits and what are the extra costs of choosing to go to net zero by 2050 rather than 2060, or 2060 rather than 2070? Nobody has ever looked at that. Well, I have, but none of the people you see talking about the policy, because that's asking a question which essentially treats this as a choice that you could make, as a choice where we could rationally decide between one set of options and another. And that, in turn, depends on asking a question: could we minimize the impact, what I referred to earlier as adaptation, rather than trying to very rapidly reduce the things? If we had tried to mitigate, to do what we're doing now, but we had started on that in 1990, the costs by 2050 would have been considerably lower than by doing it over 60 years, rather than trying to do it over 30 years, would have been much lower. That's the real problem. We're trying to do it too fast with too little consideration of what actually makes sense economically.
Tell me, if we do push this through and we go to net zero by 2050 and do, the electricity all from clean energy by 2030, what do you see to be the consequences? And I mean, in human terms, we already have people choosing between heating and eating. We already have people living in cold homes that have heart cardiovascular risk, who are more likely to go to hospital. That's just on the heating their homes. On for the economy, obviously industries rely on energy. What do you think the fallout will be, the collateral damage? I know it's difficult to explain that, but you might be able to sort of just talk about the harms of this policy.
I mean, really quite simply, we will have thrown away our economic future. It's as simple as that.
For how long?
For how long?
Yeah.
Effectively, for the next century or more.
And that's because of the costs of putting the infrastructure in and running it, and the continuing costs. It's not going to go down. Yes. It's just going to continue. So yes. We have a century of debt, or yes. of non-prosperity, of non-prosperity.
Of non-prosperity. Because the problem is, look at the British economy today. The British economy hasn't been growing in per capita terms for the last 5, even 10 years. That is because we're not investing enough in economic activities which are valued by the rest of the world. Now what we're doing is we're increasing the share of investment, which is too low in the UK. We're increasing that portion of that share which goes into essentially non-productive uses, because that's what net zero means. It's essentially, as I've already explained, producing very, very expensive alternatives to fossil fuels. And so what we're doing is we're effectively throwing away the investment that we need for everything, our social infrastructure, our economic infrastructure, our businesses and so forth. We're diverting the money from that, and we're spending it on very low productivity uses for net zero. And any country which does that is essentially condemning itself to being substantially poorer in future.
If it was the case, and you've said you don't know, that our contribution to the climate, to the warming climate is 95%, is it not worth it for the future generations that if we can somehow prevent the worst excesses of climate change by leading the way, by putting in these measures, by just reducing that impact?
We come back to this basic thing. Does what Britain do have any effect on the rest of the world? And I've spent my life working in the rest of the world. I have worked in China and India and lots of other places. To put it in the way of Gone with the Wind, they don't give a damn. In other words, the world isn't the way that people who are so concerned about these things like to believe. Leadership by Britain is of no importance to them. And China is going to do what China is going to do, irrespective of anything that Britain or even the United States says. And so the view that what we do matters in a global sense is essentially, it's politicians wanting to believe they're more important than they are. The truth is we are a fading, middle-income, middle-sized economy whose time is past. And the rest of the world knows that. And so is it then sensible to essentially spend vast amounts of money of your capital to make yourselves even poorer when it's essentially not going to make the slightest bit of difference?
The last question I was going to ask you is, you're very outspoken. As you said, you've got nothing, well, you do have things to lose. Have you faced criticism or any kind of people attempting to stop you saying what you're saying? How is your...
Yes, I mean, criticism, of course. Censorship is essentially increasingly difficult in today's world because there are so many alternative media nowadays. To be able to do what I do and to be outspoken, as I am, is, from my point of view, a liberation from a period of time when I worked in international organizations and in a corporate environment when one had to be extremely careful because essentially it was not your job to sabotage the wider goals of those organizations. But then that's ultimately why I left those kind of things, in wanting the freedom to be able to do and say the kind of things that I do. But the other thing is, debate, without debate, this gets us nowhere. You quote this 95% of scientists agree. They don't agree on anything serious. They agree on vacuous statements. Science and the kind of work I do, which is economics and other things, depends on vigorous, open debate. It does not depend on essentially the idea that there is a consensus of any value in terms of that.
And do you have colleagues or people that you know who are self-censoring as a result of the current narrative that is difficult to speak out against?
Oh, I don't think I don't think anybody who is at all critical would have any future in talking about environmental economics or a whole lot of things. They just do other things in terms of that within an academic environment and within a government environment in the same kind of way. Consensus is terribly, terribly draining in terms of good policy and indeed good social awareness, because we don't all agree on everything. And without a willingness to bring those out and talk them through seriously rather than abusively, we will never really learn.
Is there an incentive to explore this area and research this area because there's more money in it?
Of course, yes. That's always been the case, that the people who are outsiders, who are willing to entertain heterodox ideas, almost invariably accept that they do not easily receive funding in terms of government grants or lots of other things. And so what you do are things that don't require large teams, you don't require large commitment of money, etc., etc. But good analysis and other things isn't really that expensive, and it's perfectly possible to be an outsider. What is the other side of that is the sheer internal conflict that comes from people who are afraid that being associated with somebody who is outspoken and different essentially will jeopardize their reputation. So, people who believe that, it's simply not acceptable for certain things to be said.
I mean, people would argue that the fossil fuel industry has huge amounts of money and there's a big gravy train there. So why one could say, well, there's also money in that. So it doesn't follow that this is just a sort of dried up area if you look the other way.
The amounts of money from government funding are vastly greater than anything any oil company or fossil fuel things has ever spent. And actually, the amount of money from interest groups within the renewables industry is every bit as large as the spending that comes from fossil fuel. But much more seriously, I don't believe, and I think it's utterly outrageous to believe that people are doing things, saying what they say because they've been bought. Whether they've been bought by government money or by oil company money, they're saying it because they believe it. Because they believe it, they are then willing to go for funding from various sources. So it works the other way round. It is from belief to accepting money.
So that's the thorny issue, getting under the skin of this belief, because it is a widespread belief that this is important and this is necessary. And there are a lot of climate scientists who would be researching in this area and believing this area and not agreeing with you.
Yes, but that's no different from all of the quotes scientists who condemned Galileo, or I can give much more recent examples of that. The problem about this is that all of these things depend on being willing to be open to debate. And the core about this is I'm talking as an economist. I'm not claiming to be a climate scientist. I'm not claiming to be a climate modeler, but I have skills which, from the point of view of the choices that we have to make are entirely different from saying that the climate models say this, that, and the other.
Yes, I understand. So I think we've pretty much wrapped up. I know that you've spoken in the past about the threat of blackouts and some of the infrastructure that you think will be very inferior, heat pumps. And so the future of our energy systems are not looking good, even if they are more expensive. So it would be brilliant to potentially get you on to talk in more detail about the layout and how it's going to work for individual households, what you see for their individual bills and their systems, if you're happy to do that. But it's been absolutely a pleasure to talk to you today. It's really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for your insights.
We're very happy to talk to you again about those things. And it's been a pleasure.